For decades, whispers surrounded the final days of Princess Diana, rumors of a private vow, a confession, a moment that changed the course of the monarchy. But no one imagined King Charles himself would shatter the silence. And when he finally spoke, he didn't offer closure. He unleashed a secret so heavy, so deeply buried, that even seasoned royal watchers were left stunned. This wasn't just a revelation, this was a ticking bomb wrapped in grief, guilt, and unfinished promises. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What Charles revealed wasn't a mere memory. It was a vow he had carried for so long that it had fused into the very structure of his reign, shaping his choices in ways no one noticed but everyone felt. He spoke of a promise whispered in the tension of their final months, a moment woven with regret and fear, made not out of duty but desperation. And as he described it, his voice betrayed something the monarchy has spent years burying. The truth that Diana's shadow never loosened its grip on him. Every step he took after her death, every strained smile, every guarded decision was influenced by a vow he never expected to keep, and yet couldn't walk away from without betraying the woman he once failed. Behind palace walls, that vow became a silent burden, one that tightened its hold with every passing year. Advisors sensed it before he ever admitted it. They saw the hesitation in his decisions, the way he recoiled whenever Diana's name resurfaced, the moments where the past tugged him back into a place he tried endlessly to escape. They pressured him to move on, to project unity, to uphold a narrative that left no room for personal ghosts. Yet the vow refused to die. It followed him like a quiet storm, unpredictable, heavy, and always threatening to break open at the worst possible moment. Senior royals, too, recognized the danger that came with his reluctance to sever the emotional thread tying him to Diana's memory. They feared not the sentiment but the implications, because any promise made to Diana carried consequences far beyond personal remorse. Those who remembered her influence understood that she represented a force capable of shifting allegiances, unsettling traditions, and exposing fractures the monarchy preferred to ignore. And if Charles had promised her something significant, something disruptive, then the entire structure they were trying to preserve sat on unstable ground. As Charles hinted at the weight of his vow, it became clear this wasn't just a personal confession. It was a revelation capable of reopening wounds the palace had spent decades stitching shut. The kind of truth that doesn't simply revisit the past, but threatens to redefine the present. The monarchy, already fragile beneath polished appearances, now trembled at the thought of what he had been holding inside, because any promise strong enough to haunt a king is powerful enough to shake a kingdom. And as Charles edges closer to revealing what really happened, the first crack in the facade exposes a truth no one was prepared to face. The world remembers the crash, but almost no one knows what happened the night before. Diana left behind more than heartbreak and unresolved battles. She left behind a message meant only for Charles. A message that has remained hidden for years. And once we examine what unfolded in those final hours, it becomes clear why Charles now trembles at the weight of a promise he can no longer carry alone. It began with a private call he never expected to receive, a call that cut through the distance between them with a rawness he had not heard from her in years. Diana's voice carried a tremor he instantly recognized, one born not from anger or frustration, but from the unmistakable sense that something was closing in on her. She spoke quickly, almost breathlessly, as though time itself was working against her, and before Charles could steady himself, she delivered words that struck him harder than any public scandal ever had. She told him she felt watched, she felt unsafe, she felt a darkness gathering that she couldn't name, but couldn't shake. And while the world saw Diana glowing in her independence, only Charles heard the fear that lived beneath that fragile light. That fear took root in him instantly. Even after the call ended, her final sentence echoed in his mind with a weight he could never lift. He replayed her voice again and again, long into the night, unable to push aside the sharp sense that this wasn't one of their familiar emotional storms. This was different. Something inside him recognized her urgency, as if her intuition had reached further than either of them could comprehend. And though Charles tried to convince himself she was simply overwhelmed, Part of him knew she had never sounded like this before. It wasn't worry she expressed. It was premonition. Inside the palace, however, her fear was dismissed with an unsettling swiftness. Senior royals were visibly uncomfortable with any hint of Diana's growing independence, and even more so with her instinctive ability to sense threats long before others acknowledged them. They saw in her a woman breaking free from their carefully curated image, a woman whose emotional clarity threatened the structure they had built. Her words didn't stir concern, they stirred irritation, as if her vulnerability was an inconvenience rather than a warning. And Charles, caught between her distress and their indifference, felt himself fracturing under the pressure of loyalty he could no longer maintain. It was then that Diana delivered the message that would haunt him, a request she framed not as a plea, but as a final safeguard, something she needed him to do if anything ever happened to her. It was simple in phrasing, devastating in meaning, and impossible for him to ignore. Yet when the moment arrived, he didn't fulfill it. Whether out of fear, hesitation, or the crushing force of royal expectations, he let it slip through his fingers. And that failure carved itself into him so deeply that it shaped the vow he would later make, the vow that now threatens to unravel everything he built. Her fear, her urgency, her final request, they were all connected to the promise he carried, the promise he would later reveal, the promise that now threatens to expose the truth behind that night. Each element intertwined to form a shadow Charles has never fully escaped, a shadow that only grows darker as he edges toward what he can no longer hide. But it was what Diana asked of him, the part he failed to protect, that now resurfaces to tear open old loyalties. For the first time, Charles admits the truth. Diana asked him for something he had no right to promise, yet he did. A vow made in fear, in guilt, or perhaps in love, no one knows. What matters is that this promise didn't die in that Paris tunnel. It lived on inside him, reshaping his every decision, haunting every step he took toward the throne. In the quiet aftermath of their final conversation, Charles found himself holding a request that felt heavier than any crown he would later wear. Diana had not asked for understanding or sympathy, she asked for protection. But it wasn't protection for herself, it was for someone, or something, she believed would be vulnerable the moment she was gone. Her voice carried a resolve he could not ignore, a clarity that pierced through the bitterness that had once defined them. She spoke with a conviction that made Charles feel as though he was being handed a responsibility carved from the last piece of her trust. And even though he sensed the enormity of what she was asking, he agreed before he fully understood what it would cost him. As days passed and the world was swallowed by grief, Charles began to realize the depth of what he had promised. It was not a symbolic gesture. It was a directive, a duty Diana expected him to carry out regardless of royal expectation or institutional boundaries. The promise gnawed at him with increasing force, especially when he recognized that fulfilling it would set him on a path directly opposing the very traditions he was raised to uphold. Every part of the monarchy exists to preserve itself, to maintain continuity, and Diana's final wish was nothing short of a challenge to those foundations. And Charles, torn between the crown he would inherit and the woman he could never fully let go of, felt himself being pulled toward a conflict he was not prepared to face. The emotional torment that followed became a silent companion, shaping years of uncertainty. Charles battled the guilt of knowing Diana had given him one last chance to do right by her, while the institution around him pressured him to prioritize the image of unity. Palace aides sensed the shift in him almost immediately. They noticed his hesitation, his quiet defiance, the way he protected certain decisions from scrutiny. Their concern quickly turned to alarm when they realized his behavior was tied to Diana's final words. He was warned firmly, repeatedly, that speaking about the vow would reopen wounds the monarchy had spent years suppressing. But the more they tried to silence him, the more deeply the promise rooted itself in his conscience. And the most unsettling part was the identity of the one Diana wanted protected. Someone still alive, still influential, still capable of changing the course of the monarchy's future. Charles knew that honoring the vow would force him to confront the very people who had spent decades shaping his destiny. And as the truth edged closer to the surface, he felt the palace machinery tighten around him, desperate to contain a secret that could fracture everything they had built. And once Charles made that forbidden vow, forces inside the monarchy began moving against him. When Charles admitted what he had promised Diana, he didn't receive sympathy, he received warnings. The palace wasn't afraid of sentiment. They were afraid of disruption. They knew that Diana's final wish, if honored, could shift alliances, undermine bloodlines, and expose secrets buried deeper than the crown jewels. And they were prepared to stop him, whatever the cost. The moment Charles revealed even the slightest hint of his vow, senior royals reacted with a fury he had not anticipated. It wasn't emotional outrage, it was strategic panic. They understood instantly that Diana's final request wasn't a soft legacy or a symbolic gesture. It was a direct challenge to the architecture of the monarchy itself. Diana had always been unpredictable in their eyes, too beloved, too independent, too capable of shaping public loyalty in ways they couldn't control. And the idea that Charles had promised to uphold one of her final wishes sent shockwaves through secretive corridors where power is guarded, like oxygen. They demanded immediate explanations, treating his confession not as an act of honesty, but as the ignition point of a potential civil war within the royal structure. Behind closed doors, whispers sharpened into accusations, each one pointing to the same unsettling reality. Diana's final request involved rewriting future royal roles in a way the institution had never considered. She had asked Charles to protect someone who could alter the future hierarchy, someone the palace had quietly marginalized, someone whose rise would challenge the traditional order they clung to with iron resolve. And the senior royals, already wary of the emotional influence Diana still held in the public memory, were terrified that Charles might actually honor her vision. If he did, it would shift loyalties, disrupt succession strategies, and expose fractures they had spent years concealing. The resistance didn't stop at anger. Threats delicately worded and wrapped in political etiquette began to surface. Advisors warned him that speaking openly about the vow would cast doubt on his judgment, undermine his credibility, and risk stirring old scandals the monarchy had fought endlessly to bury. They hinted that the public might question his fitness to lead, that the media would devour any inconsistency. That silence was the only path left to protect the institution he would one day inherit. And yet, the more they pressured him, the more Charles felt the echo of Diana's voice urging him not to let her final request slip into the shadows. Hidden committees formed unofficial groups bound together by fear of what Charles might reveal. Meetings unfolded in hushed tones, filled with speculation, contingency plans, and strategies shaped around keeping Diana's influence sealed in the past. They discussed ways to monitor Charles, to isolate him from decisions tied to this promise, to ensure that the person Diana wanted safeguarded would never rise to the place she had envisioned. Charles sensed their maneuvering even before they confronted him directly, each whispered conversation adding to the growing awareness that he was no longer navigating the monarchy, he was battling it. And yet, amid the political pressure and the tightening grip of institutional control, he held on to one unbreakable truth. The vow was not simply an emotional confession, it was a thread connecting him to Diana's final clarity, a thread he could not sever without betraying the last moment she had trusted him. And that realization, as painful as it was, fueled his refusal to abandon the promise he had made when she needed him most. But even as they tried to silence him, Charles held on to one truth, a secret that refused to die. Why did Diana turn to this person? Why entrust them with her final fears and future hopes? Charles reveals that Diana believed only one individual was capable of safeguarding the truth after she was gone. And the moment Charles names them, everything shifts: alliances, motives, and the entire balance of royal power. The individual Diana trusted above all was not a senior royal, not a politician, and not one of the advisors who claimed to understand her better than she understood herself. It was someone who had stood beside her in silence, someone who witnessed her suffering without exploiting it, someone who held her confidences without ever turning them into leverage. This person carried a quiet strength, a resilience Diana recognized instantly, and she believed they possessed something the palace feared most: an unshakable loyalty not to the institution, but to her truth. When Charles finally spoke the name aloud, the atmosphere around him changed. It was as if he had crossed into forbidden territory, naming a figure the monarchy preferred to keep in the background, someone whose involvement could destabilize long-standing structures the crown depended on. Charles had resisted involving them for years. At first, he convinced himself that honoring Diana's trust in this individual would open doors he had spent decades trying to close. Then he feared that reaching out would expose pieces of their private lives the monarchy had worked tirelessly to bury. But beneath those excuses lay something deeper, something far more personal. This person knew Diana in ways even he did not. They had seen her at her most wounded, her most determined, her most prophetic. They had been present during the moments Diana predicted the conflicts the monarchy would face in the future conflicts she believed would only grow darker once she was gone. And Charles, still clinging to the guards he had built around his own guilt, hesitated to involve someone who held a perspective he could not control. Yet he could not ignore the emotional tension that Diana's choice created inside him. He feared this person more than he feared the monarchy, because they held knowledge that cut through every illusion the palace had constructed. They held fragments of conversations, letters, and private warnings Diana had shared in confidence. They carried the parts of her legacy the institution hoped would fade with time. If they ever stepped forward, the monarchy would not be facing mere gossip. It would be confronting a narrative built on truth, Diana entrusted to them deliberately, knowing the storm it would unleash. Diana had predicted these conflicts with brutal clarity. She foresaw the battles her sons would face, the fractures between royal branches, the unspoken rivalries, the political pressure that would swallow her memory if left undefended. She trusted this individual because she believed they could navigate those future storms with unwavering loyalty. And Charles, despite his hesitation, began to understand that this person was the anchor Diana intended him to rely on whenever the past threatened to drown him. This wasn't a symbolic gesture. Her request required action, real, tangible action that Charles could no longer delay. And as he finally moved toward fulfilling that part of the vow, the air around the palace shifted with electric tension, because everyone inside those walls understood what it meant when this individual stepped back into the story. It meant Diana's truth was no longer sleeping. It was waking up, and it carried enough force to shake the monarchy at its foundation. And the moment Charles attempted to fulfill the promise, palace tensions erupted into open conflict. Most assumed Charles moved cautiously after Diana's death, but secretly, he acted immediately. Quiet meetings, coded messages, misdirected travel logs. Charles made subtle moves that even his closest advisors failed to detect. But every attempt to honor Diana's request pushed him closer to betrayal, both of the monarchy and of those who depended on him. What no one realized at the time was that the vow Charles carried didn't sleep in the aftermath of the tragedy it ignited. The grief was unbearable, but the promise he had made was merciless, demanding action long before the world was ready for it. While the monarchy attempted to stabilize its image, Charles began working behind the scenes, taking steps that seemed insignificant on the surface, but were deliberate attempts to fulfill Diana's final wish. He reached out quietly to people she trusted, individuals the palace had always kept at arm's length. He sent brief messages that carried no visible meaning but conveyed unmistakable signals to those who understood the codes Diana used during her most vulnerable years. Each move was calculated to avoid detection, but Charles underestimated just how closely the royal machine monitored him. The resistance began almost instantly. Senior royals and advisors questioned his sudden absences, scrutinized his private correspondence, and began restricting access to people they believed could influence him. They insisted he focus on public duties, urging him to set aside sentimental distractions in favor of maintaining stability. But Charles wasn't acting out of sentiment. He was acting out of obligation, driven by the weight of a promise he feared he would never forgive himself for abandoning. Every barrier they erected only fueled his determination, pushing him deeper into shadows he had avoided his entire life. He soon discovered that his actions were being tracked more closely than he imagined. Advisors who claimed to support him began reporting his movements, and meetings he believed were private somehow appeared in internal discussions he was never invited to. The palace wasn't simply observing him, it was containing him. And as the surveillance tightened, the vow grew even more difficult to honor. Charles found himself torn between two worlds, the crown that demanded unwavering loyalty and the memory of Diana, who had trusted him with her final truth. Choosing one felt like betraying the other, and the conflict lodged itself deep in his conscience. Each step he took carried consequences that grew heavier with time. People Diana once relied on began receiving discreet warnings. Allies who attempted to help him were quietly dismissed from their positions or pushed to the outskirts of royal influence. Plans he attempted to move forward were derailed by sudden emergencies, unexpected travel requirements, or fabricated political concerns. It became clear that the monarchy feared not the promise itself, but the possibility that Charles might succeed in keeping it. The tension escalated as Charles realized there was no path forward that didn't end in sacrifice. If he abandoned the vow, he risked betraying the last genuine request Diana had ever made of him. The moral dilemma became a silent storm that haunted his every choice, pushing him toward a moment he knew would arrive. Eventually a moment where he would be forced to choose publicly, irrevocably, and in front of an audience far larger than the palace walls. And just when Charles believed he could control the fallout, one confrontation changed everything. Royal disagreements are never simple, but this was different. This was raw, violent. Years of silence erupted into accusations, betrayals, and a revelation that shook even Charles to his core. Because the moment he spoke Diana's name, everything inside the palace, the traditions, the power, the hierarchy began to fracture. The confrontation erupted during what was meant to be a controlled, private discussion, but it spiraled into something far more volatile. The second Charles revealed he had reignited the vow. Across from him stood a senior royal whose influence stretched deep into the institution's veins. Someone who had spent decades shaping narratives, controlling optics, and extinguishing anything that threatened the monarchy's carefully constructed image. When Charles admitted he had resumed contact with the individual Diana trusted most, the room seemed to tighten around them, as if the walls themselves recoiled. The response was immediate and brutal accusations hurled with a force that carried not only anger but genuine fear. They demanded to know why Charles was resurrecting Diana's legacy in a way the palace had fought so aggressively to bury. They accused him of reopening old wounds for the sake of sentiment, of risking everything the monarchy stood for simply to ease his conscience. But Charles, steady and unflinching, insisted that the vow was not about emotion, it was about truth. And the moment he uttered those words, the dam burst. Diana's name became the center of a storm the palace had dreaded for decades. Explosive accusations flew across the room, each one heavier than the last. They blamed Diana for destabilizing the institution in life and warned that she would do the same in death if Charles continued down this path. They argued that her final wish, if ever, revealed would question the very foundation of succession, roles, and power. The promise he made had evolved into a direct threat to the monarchy's survival, not because of what it contained, but because of what it implied. That the institution had ignored warnings, silenced truths, and allowed history to be rewritten for the sake of appearances. For the first time, Charles found himself hearing words that struck deeper than any public criticism. He was told, without hesitation, that if he pursued the vow further, even his position as future king could be questioned. The crowning of a monarch is not simply ceremonial, it is strategic, a balancing act of alliances and loyalty. And if Charles threatened those alliances by honoring Diana's request, the institution would not hesitate to protect itself, even if it meant undermining the son it was preparing to crown. The warning was clear. The throne was not guaranteed if he continued challenging the structure from within. The emotional tension that followed was suffocating. Old resentments resurfaced, resentments shaped by years of conflict, by wounds from a marriage that had unraveled in public view, by guilt none of them had ever acknowledged. For a brief moment, Charles felt the full weight of Diana's absence, the echo of her pain, her instincts, her uncanny ability to predict exactly where these fractures would lead. He realized she had known long before any of them that this confrontation would one day come, that the promise he made would eventually force the monarchy to face the truths they had long buried. And as the argument reached its breaking point, it became clear that Charles's decision to speak publicly was not born of impulse. It was born of necessity. The confrontation left him with no room to retreat, no space to negotiate, no way to continue hiding behind silence. The institution had made its stance painfully clear, and Charles finally understood that the only path forward was the one the palace feared most. And with no path left, Charles stepped toward the one thing the palace feared most: public truth. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a slip. It wasn't a moment of weakness. When King Charles spoke publicly about Diana's final request, the world froze not because of what he said, but because of what he implied. A secret that had been protected for decades was finally given shape, and with it came the realization that the monarchy had been shielding something monumental. The moment unfolded in a way no one predicted. What was meant to be a carefully managed appearance, a brief statement about unity, continuity, and the responsibilities of leadership became the turning point the palace had feared since the night Diana's car crashed in Paris. Charles stood before the cameras, posture steady but eyes clouded with a weight he could no longer suppress. And when a reporter asked an unexpected question about Diana's legacy, something inside him cracked. His voice, usually measured and restrained, trembled in a way that betrayed far more than the palace was prepared to allow. He paused a moment that felt like an eternity before admitting he had made a promise to Diana, one he had carried in silence for years. As the words left his mouth, the tension in the room shifted from polite curiosity to stunned disbelief. He didn't detail the vow fully, but he revealed enough to send a shockwave across continents. He spoke of a final wish Diana had shared with him, a request rooted in fear yet shaped by fierce clarity. He hinted that she had foreseen struggles her children would face, conflicts the monarchy would attempt to contain, and the possibility that one day the truth would be too heavy to hide. And in that brief, trembling confession, he acknowledged that fulfilling her wish had placed him in direct opposition to forces inside the institution he now represented. The media erupted instantly. Headlines exploded across screens, anchors abandoned. Their scripts, analysts scrambled for meaning as speculation spiraled into chaos. Some questioned what Diana could have feared so deeply that she would entrust Charles with such a responsibility. Others wondered whether her final request was tied to the future of the monarchy, its succession, or something far more personal. And while the public argued, the palace descended into panic. Behind closed doors, advisors scrambled to regain control. Statements were drafted, retracted, rewritten. Senior royals demanded explanations. Aides attempted to spin the moment as an expression of grief, a sentimental reflection misinterpreted as something more. But nothing they said could drown out the tremor in Charles's voice or the undeniable truth that he had hinted at something the monarchy never wanted the world to know. Their frantic attempts to contain the fallout only fueled suspicion that the promise was far larger, far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Yet even in this storm, one detail remained striking. Charles still hadn't revealed the full promise. The most critical part, the one that tied Diana's fear to the future, remained untouched. His words had opened the door, but he had not stepped fully through it. And as the world demanded answers, Charles seemed to carry the expression of a man who knew the next revelation would change everything. But even this confession wasn't the full truth, because the final part of the promise is something Charles still fears to admit. Charles revealed the promise, but not its ending. There was one last sentence, Diana told him, one final plea he has kept locked inside his heart for decades. And when sources close to the king finally described what he could not say publicly, it changed everything about Diana's legacy and his own. That final line, delivered in a trembling voice on the night before her death, was not a reflection on her past, but a warning about the future. Diana didn't just ask Charles to protect someone, she asked him to safeguard the future of a royal she believed would one day stand at the center of a storm the monarchy could not prevent. Her words carried a conviction that pierced Charles more deeply than he ever expected, because she spoke with the certainty of someone who saw danger long before anyone else admitted it existed. Diana foresaw a conflict that Charles still fears, a battle brewing not in headlines or public perception, but within the palace walls themselves. She sensed fractures forming in relationships, alliances shifting beneath the surface, and a future in which one of her children, or perhaps one of her grandchildren, would be forced to navigate a crisis darker than anything the monarchy had faced before. She warned Charles that the child at the center of that storm would need protection he might not be able to provide once he became king, and she made him promise quietly, urgently, that he would stand between that future royal and the forces she believed were already circling. The emotional burden of that plea stayed with him long after her voice faded. It shaped the way he approached his responsibilities, the way he reacted to internal disputes, the way he interpreted every moment of growing tension within the family. The vow didn't simply haunt him, it consumed him. He wrestled constantly with guilt, knowing that part of Diana's fear had been proven right, and regret, knowing that he hadn't done enough in the years that followed to shield the royal she had singled out. That weight pressed on him through every public appearance, every private briefing, every decision he made as prince and, later, as king. Even his health and his unraveling composure seemed tied to the relentless pressure of fulfilling a promise he knew he had delayed for too long. Sources close to Charles have hinted that the vow influenced more of his reign than anyone realized. It shaped his determination to mend certain relationships, his urgency to ease burdens placed on younger royals, and his insistence on adjusting roles that had been rigid for generations. Some believe he was quietly preparing the monarchy for a shift Diana had envisioned long before it became visible. Others argue that Charles still intends to honor the final part of her request, but fears the consequences of revealing the full truth. Because Diana's last words were not gentle, they were a warning wrapped in prophecy, a plea wrapped in fear, and a command wrapped in love. And still, the most haunting part remains unspoken. The vow he made is only partially fulfilled. There is one part, the most dangerous part, that Charles continues to hold back, knowing that to reveal it would shake the monarchy in ways it might not survive. He carries the last sentence Diana gave him like a flame he cannot extinguish, a reminder that her story did not end in Paris, and that her voice still echoes in decisions made at the highest level of power. And as the world waits for the full truth, Charles continues to stand at the edge of a promise that refuses to fade, a promise that demands action he has not yet taken. And as the monarchy braces for the consequences, one truth becomes inescapable. Diana's shadow is still shaping the future of the crown. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.